Our next speaker is Yohanan Petrovsky Shtern, who is the Crown Family Professor of Jewish Studies at Northwestern University. He's also taught at Israel, Ukraine, and Poland. His most recent book is The Golden Age Shtetl, which won a National Jewish Book Award. And he's going to speak on national memory and ethnic minorities.
Thank you very much for having me here. I'm delighted to be here together with eminent scholars, friends, colleagues, also eminent, mostly. When we talk about the doctrine of cultura, we think politics. I suggest thinking culture. And I would like to change the paradigm. I'll get back to Giedroyc at the very end of my presentation, but I would like to start with a story. You know, I always start with a story. In the middle of the 1990s, a colleague of mine, a professor of history at Kiev University, published the first textbook for college applicants on the history of Ukraine. So everybody who is applying to a college, a university in Ukraine would have his book, and it would cover all the answers to all the questions that appear during the oral exam, entry exam to any college or university. A couple of years later, he published also the first multimedia disc on Ukrainian history and culture. And then it was a book and a disc published together. It was widely available, enormous success. And he sent me the book and the disc, asking me to share my critical insights. I looked at the stuff and I was appalled. I was appalled for two reasons. First, the author of the book and of the CD, and it's a very, very serious multimedia CD, I've never seen anything like that published in Ukraine, was produced by my good friend, who I know for more than 50 years. Well, my daughter says people do not live that long, but, you know, I'm around. The second thing is that it was very badly done, and it was very badly conceived. The book presented Ukrainians, or Ukrainian history, or the history of Ukraine and its culture going back 3,000 years, you know, before the Common Era. So, of course, Tripilia Neanderthal people were all Ukrainians, as we know. Yaroslav the Wise was a typical Ukrainian who spoke brilliant Poltava dialect of the Ukrainian language because he was the wise. You know, only Ukrainians can be the wise. Skovoroda, who scholars tell us, used not more than 20% of Ukrainian linguistic element in his works, was of course a typical Ukrainian. Even General de Ribas, who was of course of Spanish origin and who was, you know, one of the founders of Odessa, he was presented as Deribasenko, excuse me. Well, not really, but somewhere close to that concept. So I wrote back saying, Vadime, excuse me, I cannot accept it as a serious history. This is not the Ukraine that I know. This is not the Ukraine that I want to see. And this is not the project of Ukrainian history that I would like to be given to students. He retorted saying, you know, this is what they demand out there in the colleges. I'm saying you have to change the paradigm. We had a conversation with him, then we have conversations with him over years, over the last 20 years. And I was trying to explain to him, as I'm trying to explain to many colleagues of mine in Ukraine, that only an insecure, ethnocentric, agoraphobic culture rejects foreign influences and allows only one ethnicity to participate in national memory making. I'm trying to tell them that Ukrainian culture has never been self-protective and insecure. It welcomed people of other ethnicities into the very center of its national building efforts and, of course, into its memory. Let me remind you that one of the founding fathers of Ukrainian integral nationalism, Vyacheslav Lepensky, was a Pole. Let me remind you, well, we discussed yesterday with Bogdan, Bogdan, we discussed Rozsтріляне відродження, right? We discussed those wonderful poets, thinkers, writers who were shot in the mid and late 1930s, and who created a vibrant, amazingly interesting avant-garde, and not only avant-garde, culture in Ukraine in the 1920s. Among these people were Oswald Buchard, who was a German who presented himself as a Ukrainian poet, Yuri Klen. There was a Jew, Ilya Hurevich, who presented himself as a Ukrainian poet, Leonid Pervomaisky. There was a Swede and a Lithuanian, Mike Johansson, who became a very important Ukrainian avant-garde poet. I would not talk about Maxim Rylski of Polish origin. I can remind you of many other, thousands of examples. One of the most, idiosyncratic one would be, everybody knows, Як мене не любити, як тебе не любити, як тебе не любити, Києве мій, right? Як тебе не любити, Києве мій. This song is written by a Jew, Ihor Shamo, who was running around the streets in Kiev listening to what we would call today klezmer groups and picking up this music that he later introduced to Ukrainian malice in his hundreds and hundreds of songs. I don't think that Ukraine needs today multi-ethnicity as a national-making concept, because this concept has always been embedded into what Ukrainian culture has been over centuries. Ukraine also needed and very often depended on multi-ethnic or non-Ukrainian ethnic mediators who made what Ukraine is today possible. Think about Czechs, who allowed and helped to establish the Agriculture Academy in Podebrady once Ukrainian government went into exile in 1920-1921. This was really the hub of Ukrainian culture in the 1920s in Europe. And later, this Podebrady Academy drifted to Munich and became Freie Ukrainische Universität, right, Frank? That's how I think. That's about that. Think about Munich and Germans who were helping to establish Suchasnost and who made Suchasnost possible as perhaps the parallel to Kultura and as the journal that was the most important diaspora journal of Ukrainians in the 1970s, 1980s. Think about other mediators of Ukrainian culture who made many things we know today as the Ukrainian things possible. We talk about the poetry of Vasil Stus, perhaps one of the two most important Ukrainian poets of the second half of the 20th century, who died in Perm prison in 1984, if I'm not mistaken, right? 1985. Thank you. His poetry was written down in the camp by Mikhail Heifetz and Arya Vudka, two Jews, very much Zionist-minded Jews, who smuggled this poetry to Israel and then sent it to Suchasnost and made possible for this poetry to be published and to be seen by the world and for the world to appreciate and understand the magnitude of the talent of Stus. Think about Polish intellectual mediation of the 1970s, 1980s. You know what? In the circles of Kharkiv, Lviv, Poltava, Odessa, Kiev, there were many people in the 1970s who wanted to have access to Kafka, to Martin Buber, to, let's say, Samuel Beckett. They couldn't. There were no books of these authors available in any Soviet store. What did they do? They went to Kiev. They went to the store called Druzhba in the Kreshcharik Street that had hundreds and hundreds of Polish books, translations of the Western literature. And you can get Kafka, and you can get Beckett, and you can get Buber in Polish. Nobody censored that, and it was available. People learned Polish to read European literature. This mediation has not been assessed and is extremely important. Well, excuse me, those who are as nationalistic-minded here as I am should excuse my next example. But Taras Shevchenko became who he became and was able to put Kobzar on paper only when he went to St. Petersburg and discovered syllabic syllabotonic principles of romantic poetry, listening and hearing the translations of Vienna Romantics, and listening and hearing the poetry of his Russian contemporaries in St. Petersburg. So this mediation that is so important for the building of Ukrainian culture has to be assessed, and this mediation is not centered in Ukrainian ethnicity. What is the Maidan? We can debate about what is the Maidan today, what is the meaning of the Maidan, why could it happen, how it functioned, and we can ask all these questions and have 2 days of debate. For me, the Maidan is, of course, the ideological and the cultural resistance of many people who live in Ukraine, of different ethnicities, who wanted one thing. They wanted to be part of Europe, and they did not want another thing. They did not want to be part of the Russian Empire, period. Who were these people? Tatar journalist Mustafa Nayyem, a very important person, a key person during the Maidan events and even today in Ukraine. Among these people were Mustafa Nayyem is of Tatar origin. Think about Natan Hazin, who appears on the screen during the Maidan revolution in his balaclava. I usually call it baklava, but excuse me. Rory, excuse me. My Turkish is not that good, rusty. Natan Hazin was the leader and the key person in the organizing of the military self-defense of the Maidan. And he is an Israeli, and he is a religious Jew. Think about Arsen Avakov. Well, we can criticize him, we can talk volumes about him, but he is of Armenian origin, and he is very much in support of the Maidan revolution. Think about Masha Nazarova, a lady, a girl, 17-and-a-half-year-old from Kiev-based school of Russian origin, who became the chief medical nurse during the Maidan events. A Tatar, an Armenian, a Jew, and a Russian. They all participated in the Maidan. This is what the Maidan is about. So we can, of course, interview Dmitry Kiselyov and Mr. Putin, don't do that, about those fascists in Ukraine and about the racists in Ukraine. But these names and their ethnic belonging speaks volumes about what Ukraine is about as a political entity. Ukraine as a country is a culture of many cultures. Its national memory should be conceived and perpetuated as, of course, as multi-ethnic. Supporting local patriotism that we discussed yesterday is something extremely important, but it also needs to be in conjunction with fostering non-ethnic, non-ethnocentric tendencies. I really admire those Ukrainians of Buchach who put a memorial plaque to Agnon and who organize festivals to celebrate perhaps the only person born in Ukraine who became a Nobel Prize winning writer. We can only imagine what it took Kievans, well, I know that it took at least 5 years, to put a memorial plaque to Janusz Korczak on one of the buildings where his orphanage was in Kiev. We know that the Ukrainian inhabitants of Chernivtsi, perhaps in conversation with the local university professor Petro Rychlo, built a monument to Paul Celan in Chernivtsi. Ukrainians in Lviv put a wonderful sculpture, very erotic, to Leopold Zachar Mazoch in Lviv. The Kievans put a monument to Sholem Aleichem. The Odessa dwellers put a memorial plaque to Isaac Babel in Odessa. But there are many other things that could be done to commemorate the multi-ethnic culture of Ukraine. Let me remind you that there was such an interesting Pole in Ukraine, born either in Pohrebiще or in Berdychev, whose name was Stanislav Józef Konrad Korzeniowski, right? Who fortunately or unfortunately became Joseph Conrad. Not a bad English writer, I need to tell you. Why not to commemorate him? Why not to commemorate Boris Pasternak, who wrote his brilliant poems about Kiev, about love, about friendship in 1931, 1932 in Irpin near Kiev? Why not to remember and to commemorate the fact that Tchaikovsky's many musical pieces were written on his, well, not actually on his, on one of the estates in Ukraine, on the Ukrainian territory? Why not to remind ourselves that Zhar Ptitsa, the fiery bird of Stravinsky, was actually written in Ukraine? When we get to the Tate Gallery, when we go to d'Orsay, when we go to Metropolitan Museum, we see these beautiful names: Sonia Delaunay, Alexander Exter, El Lisitsky, people who cost millions of dollars on Sotheby's. I wanted to buy, I could not afford. All these people are presented as the Russians, as the representatives of the great Russian culture. Excuse me, they became who they became in Kiev. They became who they became in Ukraine. El Lisitsky started with Kulturliga in 1918, 1919 in Kiev. The Salon of Alexander Exter saw wonderful painters who became who they became precisely in that particular salon. Why not remind ourselves that they were living and working in Ukraine? Why not commemorate their memory as the Ukrainian memory? Of course, we also need to commemorate the memory of the Ukrainians. We need to get the plaque of Shevelov back in Kharkiv. I believe that Ukraine is a multi-ethnic cultural locus that needs to have its national memory construed precisely in that manner. Let me remind you that Giedroyc is not only about politics, but also about culture. Of course, he created what we consider today as a path-breaking and a paradigm-suggesting journal. Giedroyc was a very ambitious person. He knew that he is creating something that would have a long-lasting repercussion for Poland. Who can tell our Polish story? Who can help building our national memory? Are only ethnic Poles to be let in? Let me remind you that Giedroyc reached out to Andrei Sinyavsky and invited him to be published na szpaltach, as they say, on the pages of Kultura, under the pen name of Abram Terz. He also reached to Solomon Goldelman, the person who was one of the top advisors in the Petlura Vinichenko's government, who was at that time in Israel, trying to get him published in Kultura. He also reached out to Ivan Koshilevets, a Ukrainian literary critic of wonderful taste and phenomenal insight, inviting him to be part of the construction of the Polish national memory in Kultura. This is a path to follow and a lesson to learn. Musimy zdążyć. Thank you.